Okay. All right, Rabbi Sai. This is a very difficult time for the Jewish people. And I want to thank you for joining me in something that I think will be therapeutic, at least for us to discuss. And I'm open to having a conversation about it and not just a shiur, depending upon the interest here. But we always prayed that this would never be a relevant issue ever again. And unfortunately, the whole topic of the halacha of Pidyon Shevuyim, of ransoming or trying to get back people who have been kidnapped, has occurred to us to a very, very serious degree of between 150 and 200 people in captivity now. And we pray to the Ribono Shel Olam that they are kept safe. And the question really that is looming over everyone's minds is that once the ground incursion takes place, what will be the fate of these people, of these innocent people who deserve to live, who have lives in front of them? Some of them are very old people, and some of them are very young people. Some of them are couples. Some of them are families. Some of them are children. And what will be the fate of these people who have so much life left to live? Very, very painful conversation. And I think that the purpose of going through this is because we want to be able to contribute something by way of Talmud Torah to the war effort. And hopefully our words of Torah study will create schus and meet wherever they're supposed to meet and be pleasing before the Ribono Shel Olam. So that's why we're here. Okay, so I hope this is not taken in any way as insensitive, because we are going to be discussing the hard facts of halacha. And sometimes when you discuss the hard facts of halacha, you forget the faces of the people that you're talking about who are going through this in real time. So let's just try to maintain both the facelessness of halacha and the reality of our brothers and sisters who are in captivity. The source of this whole sugya is found in primarily two places in Shas. One is in Bava Basra Daf Ches Amud Beis, which describes what it means to be taken into captivity. Amarle Rava L'Rabba Bar Mari, Mina Hamilsa da Amar Rabbanan. From where do we get this idea that the rabbis teach us the Pidyon Shevuyim Mitzvah Rabbahi, that ransoming captives and getting them back from their captivity is a huge mitzvah. It is, and as we'll see in halacha, it takes priority over just about everything in Hilchos Tzedakah. So where do we see this from? Amar lei dichsiv haya ki yomru elecha ana neitzeh, that the Jewish people who have just been told by the Ribono Shel Olam that they're going to be wiped out in the Churban of Bayis Rishon, and you're going to be discarded from Eretz Yisrael. And the Jewish people are going to say, where shall we go? So what does Hashem say? God instructs the prophet Yirmiyah. He says, say to them, Ko Amar Hashem, Asher lamaves lamaves, that some of you are going to die, plain and simple. Va'asher lacherev lacherev, some of you are going to be killed by the sword. Va'asher lara'av lara'av, and some of you will die by starvation. Va'asher lashevi lashevi, and whoever will be taken into captivity, that will be your fate. Va'amar Rabbi Yochanan, and Rabbi Yochanan teaches kol hamauchar b'pasuk zeh kasher mechavero, that you have a sequence. There's death, probably death by natural causes, maybe just trauma and stress, then death by the sword, then death by starvation, and then being taken into captivity. So you might think that being taken into captivity is the least, because at least you stay alive. But Rabbi Yochanan says, Adarabba, the sequence of these four are sequentially getting worse, progressively worse. So that the last one in the pasuk is the worst fate of all, to be taken into captivity. And the reason why the Gemara says later on, Shavi kasha mikulam dekulhu isnahu be, because all four are contained within being taken into captivity. In other words, because there's a great likelihood that a person will experience some level of death while in captivity, either literal death because it won't work out and the person will die in captivity, or sometimes there are fates that are worse than death, and I don't have to go into any graphic description. So it's a principle, and this principle is brought in halacha, that the mitzvah of Pidyon Shevuyim takes priority over any other tzedakah, to the point where, and I don't even have this for you in the Shulchan Aruch says that even when a community has collected money for other causes, let's say they've collected money for a Beis HaKnesses, even if the money has already been used to purchase the building materials, you can actually get your money back. You have to get your money back and use it for Pidyon Shevuyim. That's normally not the case with other tzedakah. Normally with Hilchos tzedakah, whatever the money has been collected for, it must be directed for that use. But Pidyon Shevuyim is the exception to that rule. And the reason why, the poskim explain, is because of this idea that it is such a horrible fate, that it is a mitzvah to save your fellow man from such a horrible fate. The other source that we're going to take a look at in the Gemara is a Gemara in Gittin, is a Mishnah in Gittin rather, which says, Ein podin es ha-Shevuyim yoser al kedei demehen, which is, the Mishnah is now telling us certain parameters that the Chachamim instituted to restrict the rules of engaging with kidnappers. Even though it's a horrible fate, but there are limits to what you can expect the community to do when ransoming back someone who's been kidnapped. And one of the rules is that if they are asking for an exorbitant amount, yes, what the Mishnah calls yeser al demehen, more than what would normally be reasonable for such a person in the community, then you don't ransom the individual. Many of you may be familiar with the story of the Maharam Rutenberg, who was kidnapped. They were expecting an exorbitant fee for his ransom, and his commandment to the community was, leave me be. I would rather die in captivity than the community spend funds that it can't well afford. You need this money for the infrastructure of the community and probably to feed orphans and widows. That's a better use of the money. And that's actually what happened. The Maharam Rutenberg ended up dying in a prison, in a dungeon, and it took years for the Jewish community to be able to retrieve his remains. The next, and the reason says, the Mishnah is mitnei tikkun ha'olam. It's because of tikkun ha'olam. Now, what is tikkun ha'olam? So it's debated in the Gemara what tikkun ha'olam means. So there are two explanations. One is the way, like the Bartanura says, Shelo yimsuru hanochrim atzmam laharbos lahavi Shevuyim. He says, because if the captors are successful in getting the exorbitant ransom that they're asking for, this will only incentivize them to kidnap more people. Because it'll incentivize them to kidnap more people. And the way that the Gemara expands it is that it depends. Is tikkun ha'olam to help the community from breaking the back of the community? Or is it more like the Bartanura says, that we're concerned that they're going to, even if an individual would be able to come up with the ransom. Let's say they kidnap someone who's from a very wealthy family. They end up kidnapping Patty Hearst, and they're holding her for a ransom, right? So the community doesn't have to come up with the money. Is there still a tikkun ha'olam involved? That there's still like a requirement not to ransom more than what she's worth? So the machlokas is it a concern about overstressing the community, Or is it even when the community is not stressed, by allowing her to be ransomed, you're only incentivizing future kidnappers to do the very same thing? The Bartanura seems to say like the latter, to the point where there were situations that are discussed in the poskim where people's family members were kidnapped, and the poskim of the time said, you may not ransom them, even though you have them, you can come up with the money because of tikkun ha'olam. We have to make sure that this does not repeat itself. The other takana that the Chachamim made, as far as limiting getting back captives, is ve'ein mavrichin es hashvuyim. You're not supposed to invade do a raid on where the captives are being held and do like an Entebbe style raid into Uganda to capture the captives back. And the reason why is mipnei tikkun ha'olam, also because of tikkun ha'olam. Now, what is the tikkun ha'olam involved over there? So there's a machlokas between the Tanakama and Rab Shimon ben Gamliel, which is why Rab Shimon Gamliel says, Omer mipnei takanas hashevuyim. He agrees that there's a concern that the rabbis limited us, but the machlokas is as follows. Are we concerned that if we allow a raid like a raid on Entebbe, that this is going to cause future kidnappees to be treated more harshly? Because maybe the captors will take additional security measures and treat their captives more harshly? Or is it out of a concern that if, let's say, there are multiple captives and we do a raid and save one, then the other captives that are currently in captivity will be treated more harshly? But either way, that's the second takana. So takana number one, you can't ransom a person for an exorbitant amount, which is a monetary issue. And halacha number two, or takana number two, is that you cannot raid by force a place where the kidnappers are holding the captive and take the captive back by force, even if you have the firepower to do so. Those are the two takanos that the Mishnah makes. So already you're seeing something very strange being limited by us, by the Mishnah. And the question is, how do we translate that into modern times? Before we get into a responsum that I want to share with you tonight, or really it's more like an essay, let's take a look at two pieces from the Aruch HaShulchan, which is being written at the turn or right before the turn of the 20th century. The Aruch HaShulchan, when he talks about this halacha of Pidyon Shevuyim, he says, in source number 4, he says, let me just share my screen for the recording. Just give me 1 second. There we go. He says, V'chol, source number 4, the Aruch HaShulchan says, V'chol zeh haya bizman hakadmon. He says this whole mitzvah of ransoming captives is from a bygone era, because today we don't deal with that anymore. V'gam ata b'ktzavot harichokot b'midbariyot she'ba'Asia, b'Africa. He says the only other places in the world, in Europe, the Polish don't kidnap, okay? The Russians don't kidnap. They may do blood libels, they may do pogroms, they may do other things, but kidnapping is, thank God, not something that we have to worry about in Eastern Europe. But it still goes on today, he says, in certain parts of Asia and Africa, in the desert lands, in the wilderness, shenoflim shololim al overei hadrachim, that you get people that are shanghaied or kidnapped. V'notlin osan bashevi, and they take them into captivity to be slaves. Ad shapodim osam b'mamon harbe, until they are ransomed for large sums of money. Ki yadua mehashayarot haholchot b'midbar arav, as we know from where the places where people travel in the desert. Maybe he's referring to the Sahara, not sure. Okay, and in source number 5, towards the end of the siman, he says, V'im kol godel hamitzvah shel pidyon shvuyim, mikol makom shanu chachamim b'mishnah de'in poden es hashvum yoser al kedei demehem mipnei tikkun ha'olam. He says that you're not allowed to spend exorbitant amounts because of tikkun ha'olam. And the Aruch HaShulchan simply basically gives the clair of the Gemara that I had spoken at outside. V'yesh beGemara ibaya mahu zetikan ha'olam. Imishum duchka ditzibura. Is it because it's going to drain the resources of the community? Ulefizeh, if that's the concern, im yesh lo karov ashir ve'ein sarach lahatil hapidyon al hatzibur mutar. In which case it would be permitted as long as there's a wealthy relative who can do it on his own. Laharbos bepidyon. Oatam kedei delo ligarvu v'laisi tvei sha'shavuyim keshiyiru shemarbin bepidyonim yimsru nafsham lignov harbe nefashos me'itan. Or is the concern that even if there is someone in the family that can cover the whole cost of the ransom, but by allowing people to be ransomed for money, you're only encouraging further kidnappings. Let me also point out that this is a real issue in Mexico today as well. It's not just in Asia and Africa. We have some Mexican members who are from Mexico, and some of them actually moved to Canada specifically for the reason that they didn't want to continue living in Mexico, because members of the Jewish community who are more affluent are targeted by kidnappers. And it's a business. It's mamish, a business that they will kidnap a child of a wealthy family, hold them for ransom, you pay the ransom, and you get your child back. And many people just didn't want to live that way anymore. And therefore, he says that the Rambam paskins like the second reason, that it's really because of disincentivizing. We don't want to encourage kidnappers to repeat these offenses. And he says the Torah and the Shulchan Aruch paskin that way as well. And therefore he says, Va'afilu bi'ishto, Pasak be'perik dalad mi'ishos, ve'eno poda osa yoser midameha. That even if you're your own wife, you cannot ransom her back more than what she's worth, which we can make a lot of interesting quips about that, I'm sure. But then he quotes the Torah as saying that no, some poskim hold that ishto kegufo, v'chein latalmud chacham, o afilu adayin hu katan v'nikr b'charifos sichlo sheyihiye talmud chacham podin osam b'damim merubim. And another exception that's brought by the poskim is if someone is a big talmud chacham or he's a very, very brilliant child prodigy, then that would also be grounds to sort of bend the rules and spend more than you would normally spend. And some say that you can even, for your own personal relatives, you're permitted to spend large amounts of money. But thankfully, today in our world, this no longer exists. That's what the Aruch HaShulchan writes again. And then he writes, when he talks about V'chein ein mavrichen es hashvuyim lahotziim me hashvuyim below Pidyon mi beitikan ha'olam, he says, Shelo yihiyu ha'oivim machbidim oilam al yeser hashvuyim. He says the reason why you can't do an Entebbe raid is because if you do and you save one captive, they'll make life miserable, far more miserable for the other captives. Umarbim bishmirasam elapodim em bichdei demehem. But rather you have to negotiate using cash. You can't storm them. Storm, what would be the right word? Right? B'shir kedei demeim lo yadanu kama uchashiyesh sakanas nefashos yesh on shepodim yefsim bichdei demeim v'yesh megamgemin. He says, and it's very hard to determine what that amount of money is. And it's really unclear, especially when you know that if you don't come up with the sum, they will kill the captive. And so there's a big discussion in the poskim, what you're supposed to do, halacha l'maisa. And he ends up by saying, because this is no longer prevalent, we don't need to go into any great detail about all of the different shitos. Now, before we go any further, what is the fundamental difference between the halacha as it is discussed by the Gemara, the Mishnah, and the Aruch HaShulchan and the poskim, and the situation that we are facing today? Conceptually, what is the difference? It's not for money, okay. Okay. I don't even know whether that's even been put on the table yet, has it? What were you going to say, Eddie?
The same principle. Don't not more than what the training.
Unclear?
This is a military conflict. Military conflict.
So that's the issue in halach. That's the dion that we have to see tonight. Is a military operation different from the historical precedent that is discussed up until now, which is where people did this as a way of making money? You know, we have your wife, you want a briefcase of unmarked bills for $1 million. I'm thinking, right? You know, that, you know, Jack Benny, right? Right.
Knowing that they'll have a potential military operation would actually be going against that they would be de-incentivizing it.
Correct. But potentially, when a nation is at war with a hostile entity, that could potentially change the entire halachic paradigm. And that is indeed what is going to be argued in the article that we're going to see tonight, which is really a compendium of a number of different tshuvas that were penned in the 20th century. So this article was written about 10 years ago. It appears in a Torah journal called Emunat Itecha, which has been publishing journals since 1985. It is from I think it's called Torah Ve'Haaretz, I think is the name of the organization. It is a Dati Le'umi think tank that started in Gush Katif and since then has moved to somewhere near the Gaza envelope is where it's based. And it's been publishing consistently. They're now up to around issue 125 of the journal. So it's been publishing consistently since 1985. And it has articles from different Rabbanim, Poskim, Russia, Yeshiva. You'll find articles in there for Machon Pua. You'll find articles in there for the organization Tzomet. So it's a very, very reputable journal. I referenced it on my Otsar HaChachma today, but also they have a website where they have archived a number of their articles, Torahland.org, Torah Ve'Haaretz, right? Now, the historical precedent for what's going to be discussed, there are two cases that we'll discuss. One is the raid on Entebbe, which we are all familiar with, where the Israeli army knew that there were Palestinians had hijacked a plane, an Air France flight, taken it to Uganda, and were holding captives for a prisoner trade. And there was a military operation where, you know, the story about Yoni Netanyahu was killed. And then I think one of the hostages was killed as well, an elderly woman, but all of the other hostages were saved. That happened on July 4th, 1976. We remember it very well because it was the America's bicentennial. The other case that I want to bring to your attention is this case of Nachshon Waxman, Zichrono Livracha, which happened in 1994. The abduction and killing of Nachshon Waxman, I'm just reading from the Wikipedia article, was an incident in which Palestinian Hamas, history repeats itself, abducted Israeli soldier Nachshon Waxman from the Bnei Atarot junction in central Israel and held him hostage for 6 days. The incident ended in a failed Israeli rescue attempt during which Waxman, 3 of his captors, and an Israeli officer were killed. Not have a positive outcome, sadly, tragically. So let's take a look at this essay. This essay builds upon tshuvot that are from Rav Ovadia, tshuvot from Rav Shaul Yisraeli, from Rav Yosef Henkin, and from Rav Goren. And it's sort of like a compendium, and that's why I thought this would be a very helpful journal article. It's titled Pidyon Shevuyim, Mitzvat Shichrur Shevuyim Hi Me'amitzvot HaChashuvot Shabbat Torah. right? So we know that the mitzvah of Pidyon Shevuyim is one of the most important mitzvahs in the Torah. Lamrot zot ve'ulai dafka biglal chashivuta shel hamitzvah. He says, despite that, and perhaps because of its great importance, Chachmei Yisrael hitilu hagbalot ala shichrur kidei linoa shichrur b'chol mechir. That the rabbis placed restrictions on this mitzvah in order to prevent placing impossible price tags on this mitzvah. Okay, it's an article written by Rav Ido Rechnitz and Rav Elazar Goldstein, and let's take a look. The first two sections of the article are a review of the basic halacha that we've seen already. So let's go into the meat of the article on the bottom of page 1. Chatifa shehi chelek memilchama. When kidnapping is a portion of a war. In other words, it's not done for financial gain, but rather it is done as part of an act of war. Lichaora, shtei hatakanot ha'amurot. It would seem that these two takanos that the rabbis instituted, which is you cannot pay more than a reasonable amount, and number 2, you're not allowed to perform a raid to take back the captives by force. Einan mityashvot im hanoheg sheyeshno b'medinat Yisrael. These two takanot are not consistent with the conduct of the Israeli government. Medinat Yisrael noheget lifdot shvuyim gam b'tumura mufrezet. The state of Israel is accustomed to doing hostage redemption, even with inflated swaps, af she'ena kaspit, even when it's not monetary, but we will trade, let's say, 1,000 lives for 100 lives, right? Vihi af eina nirta'at me'asiyat pu'ulot tziva'iyot l'chilut hashvuyim. And the state also does not refrain from conducting military operations, military raids to save captives. Dugma lepu'ula misug zeh hi ha'pu'ula l'shichrur Nachshon Waxman. And an example of that was the military operation that was attempted to free Nachshon Waxman. Semel Nachshon Waxman nechtaf bidei mechablim bishnat 1994. So he was kidnapped in 94. La'achar yamim mispar hitkala shuhu muchzak bebayit b'kfar Bir Nabala. And so later on, it was discovered, they found out where he was being held hostage. Ve'al sayeret matkal hutla hamisima l'shachruro. And so they tagged the elite forces of Tzahal to liberate him. B'mahalach ha'pu'ula ratzchu hamechablim et Nachshon Waxman v'seren nir Porez neherag. So not only did they end up killing Nachshon Waxman, I guess on their way into freeing him, but they also killed Captain Nir Porez, I'm not sure how to pronounce his last name. He was also killed. Mikre ze orer diyun tziburi b'she'elat ha'mechir shel chilutz b'koach. So he says this incident raises a lot of questions as far as what the public policy should be when thinking about the high cost of saving captives, l'umat hachilufa shel haya'anot lidrishot hachotfim. Right, when taken into the counterbalance, or like sort of contrasting that with the proper response for the welfare of the captives. In other words, on the one hand, you've got public policy issues that you need to show that you're a strong state, and that you won't tolerate your citizens being kidnapped. And on the other hand, you have to be concerned about the welfare of the captives, that if you show too much military might, you could end up getting the captives murdered. Din halachti domeh hitkayem la'achar ha'pu'ula ha'mutzlachat l'shichrur nosei tisat Air France mispar 139 shenechtavu le'Entebbe. He says the same question was raised when there was a military operation to save the hijacked flight 139, Air France 139 from Entebbe. The reason, however, why it didn't raise so many question marks is because it was a successful raid, right? When everything works out in the end, so you don't have to do any diyunim, you don't have to have any of these kinds of deliberations. But once we've done an operation that ended up failing and ended up getting the captive and also one of the fighters killed, then we have to ask ourselves the question: was it worth it? Was it justifiable? And that was called, the Entebbe raid was called Mitzvah Yonatan. Okay. Al reka hamikorot shehuvu la'el otah sheila. So based on, in light of all of the sources that we've brought above, which seem to say that there are takanos that Chazal instituted, the question is raised: Ha'im yesh latzeit lemivtzat tzva'i sheyesh bo sikunim mashma'utiyim lachatufim ulemachalitzim? Is it permitted, according to halacha, to conduct a military operation that presents significant danger to the captives and to the soldiers? Bebasis hagisha hayehudit l'shelot elu omedet hahavana she'irua chatifa shel irgonei terror u'irua milchamti. So this is probably the most important line of the essay, that one of the foundations of our whole approach that the modern poskim take to this issue is that we have to appreciate that a kidnapping that takes place by a terrorist group now becomes an act of war, ve'eno irua plili. And it's not just simply a criminal act of kidnapping, but it's a military operation. Alkein yesh livchon oto laor dinei hamilchama v'ikaron ha'arevut. And therefore, now it has to be judged in a completely different light, based on the rules of war, not just the rules of ransoming captives, but the rules of war and the principle of arevut, of communal responsibility, having to do with making sure that the entire state remains healthy as a result of the operation. So based on that, Rav Shaul Yisraeli writes as follows: Din milchemet mitzvah be'ezrat Yisrael miyad tsar, ulo rak kesheklal Yisrael natun b'sakana. So a milchemes mitzvah, that we are commanded to go and engage in war with our enemy, is not just when our lives are in danger, elagam keshehamudubar al ayara Yisraelit bodedet. But it's true even when one neighborhood is bisakana. If even one little town or one little moshav is in danger, that is a justification for the entire Medina to engage in war. Shekol echad bitzva labo l'sakein atzmo al menat lahatzil. And in that case, even though normally, when it's not a time of war, a person is not allowed to put himself in sakana to save another person's life. But in this situation, there is a mitzvah for people to put themselves in a makam sakana as a soldier in order to save even one person's life who is attacked. Gam ka'asher pu'ulat terror misakenet kvutzak tana yachasit ba'am va'afilu adam boded. And therefore, this will also apply that when a terrorist group places the life of a small group of people in danger, even if it's just one person, Kol Yisrael mitzuvim lahatzil et eila sheniklu l'sakana, then the onus falls upon all of Klal Yisrael to place themselves in jeopardy in order to save the life of that small group of captives or even that one individual. Irua shel chatifa al reka le'umani hu irua milchamti. And therefore, when a person is kidnapped by a terror group, that is an act of war. Sheyesh lahachil alav et ikranot dinei milchama. So the principles of warfare now set in, and it's no longer just a matter of Pidyon Shevuyim. Ve'etem lekach katav harav Yehuda Henkin. And so I meant to say Rav Yehuda Henkin. So Rav Yehuda Henkin writes a similar idea. He writes as follows. And by the way, if you want to look up all of the sources in their original, they're all footnoted in this article. He writes as follows: Ein mashgichim b'sakana livnei ha'aruva. He says, we don't reckon with the danger that we are placing the captives in. That is not part of our calculus. Shekain b'chol milchama ein mashkichim bifrat. Now listen to what he says. When you're involved in warfare, there is a shift of focus from the individual to the country, from the individual to the populace. And therefore, when you know that as a group of individuals have been kidnapped, the primary focus is on winning the war and not on saving the captives. Umutar la'aroch pu'ulat tzva'it laharog et hachotfim. And it is therefore permitted, according to halacha, to create a theater of battle with the objective of killing the captors. Vagam ilu haya efshar la'aroch pu'ulat tzva'it. And even when it's impossible to organize military action, ein chiyuv lehe'anot lidrishot hachotfim kidei lahatzil b'nei ha'aruva. There is no obligation to respond to the requests of the captives in order to save them. Umutar la'ozvam lenafsham rachmana litzlan Hashem yishmerenu im hatzorech kein b'nihul hamilchama. If it is necessary for the success of the war to forsake the captives, then the priority becomes on winning the war over saving the captives. These are very painful words to hear. It's very, very difficult for us to even read this in the context of what is going on right now. But I point this out only so that we understand that there are halachic considerations that are being taken in, no doubt are being taken into account. Umikan, and from here, based on this, shahatakanot shenikva'u b'inyan Pidyon Shevuyim ne'emru ka'amur b'nogea lachatifot peliliot einan chalot b'milchemet haterror. And therefore, all the rules and the limitations on Pidyon Shevuyim and all of the great exhortations to save the captives, when it comes to the mitzvah of Pidyon Shevuyim, do not apply when engaging in a war on terror. Behemshech lekach nir'eh shegam ha'hagbalot shenikva'u b'nogea legova hatemura shemutar l'shalem avur shichur ha'shevuyim einan chalot b'mikre shel shevuyei terror. He says, even when it comes to the price that is placed, let's say they want to do a prisoner swap. He says that even if it's a fair prisoner swap, there is no obligation for the army to concede to that swap when you're fighting a war on terror. Uvimikre kazeh lo nishlal pidyon shvuyim biyoter michadei demehen. And therefore, there is no such thing as a restriction on paying more than what the captives are worth. In other words, he's saying it on the other hand as well. Shegam ha'hagbalot shenikba'u b'nogea legova hatmura. He says, even under normal circumstances where Pidyon Shevuyim has limitations placed upon it, there are no limitations when you're fighting against terrorists. And therefore, if in the course of trying to win a war, the calculus is that we will win this war more effectively by ransoming the captives for an exorbitant swap, that is also permitted. And similarly, in a situation where the army feels that it will be most effective for the war effort to do a violent raid on where the captives are being held, like Entebbe, then it is not prohibited, despite the fact that normal restrictions are placed on Pidyon Shevuyim for that. Ha'achra'a binyan zeh kamo b'chol shelat bitachon misura lemifkedei hatzava. And therefore, these determinations have to be made not by a psak in Shulchan Aruch, but rather the security experts, the people who tell you what will be the most effective way to win the war. And those people are the leaders in battle, leaders of the army. Uverosham lememshelet Yisrael shehi hamifaked ha'elyon shel tzahal. And that includes the Israeli government, which is in charge of the Israeli army. Omnam, afal pi shehasamchut lahachriya b'nogea lepidyon hashvuyim mesura lememshelet Yisrael, But despite the fact that sort of the decision is ultimately in the hands of the government, nitan lilmad mehamekorot ikronot manchim lamediniyut ru'uya b'nosei zeh. But there are certainly guidelines that we can extract from the sources, toch hatamatam lahakesher hamiyuchad shel shvuyei milchemet haterror, that also will be applicable to fighting a war on terror. Nidon efo bekama amot mida merkaziot besugya zu, and therefore we'll touch on a few points. He says, shemin haro'ui sheyamdu leneged einehem shel mekablei ha'achlatot, that should be part of the calculus of anyone who's in charge of making a decision. And therefore, he goes into shikulim litvach aroch. He says long-term considerations and short-term considerations. So the section number 4 is hayesod harishon v'hachashuv biyoter hu she'iska shel pidyon shvuyim tmurat shichur mechablim tzricha lihibachen al pi tovat klal hatzibor. You have to take into consideration first and foremost what is in the best interests of the Israeli public. L'tvach katzar u'l'tvach aruch, both in the short term and in the long term. Kviya zu mitchayevet ma'arach ha'arevut u'mimatzav ha'milchama. That will require an analysis of the community situation and the war situation. Everything has to be analyzed through the lens of the public welfare and not through individual welfare. And by the way, that's what you're seeing going on in Israel today. The ethicists in Israel are no doubt basing themselves on these ideas. There are individual requests from families. Please get my grandmother, my daughter, my wife, get them out of captivity. And they're heart-wrenching pleas. But the Israeli government's response, even though it's unspoken, is we have to take into account what is in the best interests of the state, of the public, before we can take into what's in the best interests of your particular relative. And as heartless as that sounds, that is the halachic analysis that is ultimately going to prevail. הבדל זה הוא היסוד שבגללו אפשר לפקוד על אדם לסכן את עצמו למען אדם אחר, אף שבעת שלום אין זה מעשה מחייב. He says, and that for that reason, because we're in a state of war, is the whole basis why it's permissible to tell a person to place his life in jeopardy to go out to war and to go into the battlefront, even though normally you can't obligate someone in a time of peace to endanger their lives in order to help save other people's lives. Bishat milchama ein bochanim et hashe'elot minakunat mabato shel haprat. During war, we do not analyze the questions at hand based on the perspective of the individual. Shebishat shalom eino chayav l'saken et atzmo ba'avur acherim, because during peacetime, there's no obligation to endanger your life for the sake of saving someone else. Ela minikudat mabato shel haklal. You have to always look at it from the public perspective. Behetem lekach be'et milchama yesh libchon et tovat haklal l'tvach aroch v'lo rak l'tvach katzar. And at the same time, you have to look not only at the short-term benefits of this operation, but at the long-term benefits. Good lahalacha bizman shalom. הקובעת שאם אדם בצרה כגון חולה לפנינו יש לעזור לו ולא לשקול את הסכנות העלולות להיות מכך בעתיד. He says when it comes to a private individual, let's say you're dealing with someone who's deathly ill, you have to help him and not take into account what the long-term effects of the treatment might be. But במצב מלחמה יש פוסקים הסבורים שהדין שונה. But when you're engaged in a war, you can't just look at, well, we got to save this group of people. You have to look at the long-term benefits of any operation and think about what the welfare of the country will be long-term, not just the immediacy of saving this group of people, but what will be the long-term outcome for the country. And no doubt, it would probably be beneficial to save lives in the short term by negotiating with terrorists and trading the people who are in captivity and getting them back and then leaving Hamas alone. But in the long term, that would be a disaster. It would be an absolute, right, unmitigated disaster, because that would send a message not only to Hamas, but to Iran as well, that Israel is prepared to wave the white flag, no matter how many of our people are murdered and taken captive. We haven't seen any differentiation, but in our situation, we're dealing with Jews. La'orzot, kasher, and this will be our last paragraph until we get to the conclusion of the article. La'orzot, kasher medubar bi'iska lepidyon shvuyim, nukudat hamabat chayevet liyot tziborit v'lo ishit. Like we said up until now, the perspective has to be, even with saving captives, has to be what is in the public's best interest, not in those individuals who are captives. Yesh lirot bifrat aver shel haguf hatziburi. You have to look specifically at the limb of the public. In other words, looking at you look at a group of people who are taken captives as a limb of the body politic, of the body, looking at the whole Am Yisrael as one body. You may have to amputate the arm in order to save the rest of the patient. Okay? Ulefichach, amat hamida harishana v'hachashuba biyoter hi tovat klal hatzibor l'tevach aroch. And therefore, you must, as the prime criterion, must look at the long-term benefits to the nation. Yetera mizu b'shanim ha'achranot mechablim rabim ma'od sheshuchreru bi'iskat Pidyon Shevuyim chazru lilchom b'Yisrael miyad. An additional factor is that whenever we've done a prisoner swap, the people who were in Israeli prisons went back into the general populace and committed more acts of terror. Harei sheli'itim mechir ha'pidyon hu sakana behoveh v'lo rak sakana be'atid. In which case, freeing prisoners in a hostage swap will sometimes have immediate negative effects and not just long-term negative effects. Lefi ha'ikaron shel merkaziyut tovat haklal ulefi erech ha'arevut yesh la'asot kol ma'amatz lahagen v'lishmor al kol prat mipnei ha'sakana b'tvach ha'katzar u'b'tvach ha'aroch. And basically, he's just summing up. You should do whatever you can to protect every individual hostage, save them from danger, but it has to be with the primary focus on the welfare of the public. And there are a number of different other considerations that are taken up in this article. How do you establish what is in the best interests of the public? Ish kochot habitachon shenafal bashevi. Do you make exceptions when a person who has state secrets has been taken captive? And there may be even more of a reason to pay an exorbitant amount, even with prisoner trade, in order to prevent those state secrets from falling into the wrong hands. Shiur adam shichnis et atzmo l'sakana miyuteret. What do you do when a person has been kidnapped but was negligent in allowing himself to be kidnapped? Like, a guy goes to Ramallah and says, "Oh, I want to be your friends, my fellow human beings," and then they go ahead and they kidnap him. Like, is there any bichlal? Does that create a mitigating circumstance that we can be even more lenient in letting that person remain as a captive? And then finally, the last topic that he deals with is shichur gufa, is the liberation of a corpse. When you know that the captive is already dead, what prices need to be paid or should not be paid in order to get the body back. And of course, Israel is holding on to the bodies of killed Hamas members in order for there to be an eventual hopeful swap of fallen hostages. Rahmana litzlan. Sikum. So let's just look at the conclusion of the essay. Mitzvat shichur shvuyim hi me'amitzvot hachashuvot shebatorah. So the mitzvah of saving captives is one of the most important mitzvot in the Torah. Lamrot zot ve'ulai dafka biglal chashivuta shel hamitzvah, but despite this, and perhaps because of its great importance, Chachmei Yisrael hitilu hagbalot al hashichrur. Our sages placed restrictions on what we can and cannot do in order to free captives, kidei limnoa shichrur b'chol mechir, to prevent paying ultimate prices for the liberation of hostages. Hagbalot eila chalot al chatifa plilit ve'inan chalot al shvi shelo chamim b'milchama. However, those restrictions only apply to criminal acts of kidnapping, not to acts of war. The gamlo b'milchemet terror, including when there's a war on terror. Shvi misug zeh nidon behetem liikranot dinei hamilchama. You apply the rules of warfare between one national entity and another when dealing with that kind of kidnapping. Hasmachot b'shikol hadat b'nogea l'shichur shvuyim b'zman milchama nitunim lemifaked ha'elyon shel hatzava memshelet Yisrael. And therefore, the decision has to be ultimately made by the chief of command, the commander-in-chief, which is the Israeli government. Imzot, with all of that, nitan ligzor min ha'agbalot ha'amurot ikronot achadim sheyesh behem kedei lahanchot et shikol hadat hanogea li'iru'ei chatifa al reka bitchoni. He says, nonetheless, he says you can certainly derive certain parameters that should act as guidelines when trying to deliberate over what to do when there is this type of kidnapping. ונכון שהמדינה תקבע עקרונות רלוונטיים למציאות המודרנית ברוח זו. And therefore, the state should try to use these kinds of relevant principles and apply them in that spirit. ואלו השיקולים שמן הראוי לשקול בעת החלטה על עסקה מסוג זה, and the relevant considerations or sort of the guidelines that the state should keep in mind when making its decisions should be the following four. Number one, yesh lishkol et tovat haklal v'habitachon haleumi b'tvach hakatzar v'ha'aroch v'lo rak et tovat haprat. Number one, you have to weigh the welfare of the nation, both in the short term and in the long term, and not simply focus on what is best for the individual victims. Number two, yesh latet adifut miyuchedet l'shichur adam shenafal be'et sheruto v'kochot habitachon. You should give priority to someone who has been kidnapped when he was acting as an agent or as a security, a person who's in charge of security, because such a person, number one, has devoted himself to the nation, and therefore we should work harder for him. And number two, you want to preserve state secrets. Number three, yesh latet adifut nibucha la'adam shenafal bashvil achar sheichnis et atzmo b'modal sakana. You should give lower priority for saving someone who knowingly and negligently allowed him, put himself in a makam sakana. And number four, lamrot chashivuta shel mitzvot haba'at chalal likvura, despite the great mitzvah of burying a corpse, ein l'shachrir mechablim kidei liftot gufot min hashevi. You should not free terrorists in order to be able to procure a body for burial. Nor should you endanger soldiers and putting them across enemy lines in order to be able to retrieve a corpse. Okay, that's the gist of it. Anyone want to comment or discuss? Alan. Could be they did. Could be they did. Could be they asked Rav Goren. Yeah. Let us know what you discover.
Somebody's engaged as a chayal. They have a higher priority to ransom.
Right. So it seems like that was consideration number two. If he's part of Anshe Kochot HaBitachon, if he's part of Israeli security forces or part of the army, he does get a higher priority than a civilian. Yes. Anyone else? Yes, Paul.
Changing prisoners where you're putting more at risk. I don't understand the situation apart from the state secret, so maybe that's the answer. Where we would potentially release terrorists to free a captive. I know it sounds really harsh and I hesitate to ask the question, but I'm just thinking about subsequent family members who then get hurt by this terrorist that was released.
Yeah. I mean, obviously, these are just guidelines that he's providing, and so that these rabbis are providing, and therefore, you have to take both issues into consideration. If the demand is to free a terrorist who we know is going to repeat the offenses, then maybe even a person who has state secrets couldn't justify him being freed.
Wondering what constitutes a war, or does it really matter? Allah. So, for instance, does a war have to be declared? Because you could say that for years and years and years, Hamas and Israel were engaged in a de facto war. So it doesn't matter whether a war has been declared or whether in reality a war is taking place in terms of halacha.
Yeah, this is a de facto war. Yeah, this is de facto war. Even the case of Nachshon Waxman was considered by the poskim to be an act of war. So it's a terrorist war.
And it supersedes any halachic consideration. That has always been in Lamed and many others that we always felt that, and that is different than when they captured this billionaire from Syria, whatever it was.
Yeah.
It's a different. So when you put on a Sahal uniform, it's that was always. And I wonder if he's referencing there because he's quoting from it. He seems to be saying that because it comes out that according to what we just learned, it's the exact opposite of this psak that has been the mainstay of psak in the community.
Right. So it seems to be, this is paragraph Vav, where he talks about ish kochot habitachon shenafal bashevi. It seems that the argument would apply to members of Tzahal as well. Although the idea that he's mentioning are people who were involved in the security as acting as spies. The two examples that he gives are Ran Arad and Jonathan Pollard, that they were acting in the interests of the state. And so if they were taken captive, right, Ran Arad by Syria, right, do I have that right? And Jonathan Pollard by the United States, then the argument from Rav Shali Yisraeli is that the way he writes is shekeven she'ela yatzula milchama b'shlichut hamedina umita'ama. Since these people went out to war acting as shlichim of the state and with their command, lahaganat ha'am hayoshev b'tzion, for the sake of the protection of the people of Zion, Hare kayemet ve'omedet hitchayvut bilti ktuva. Exactly those words. In other words, there is an unspoken or an unwritten obligation avol muvenet me'eleha that is implicit. Shekol hishtadlut sheyesh b'idei hamedina la'asot kidei lifdotam b'mikra sheyiplu b'shevi aleha la'asot. But the state has to do whatever it can to get those people back. No man left behind, right? Right. They do have soldiers. They do have soldiers. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. Yeah, no, but I would still remind you that the overriding principle is do what's best for the public, even if it means, I think so. In other words, right, no, because right, in the context of this essay, when you look at the whole body of the essay, the number one overriding factor is what's in the best interests of the state, both short-term and long-term. Then there are guidelines that you should utilize within that overriding sort of mission statement that should help guide you. And those are, and included in that is take into consideration who is being taken captive, right? And that person takes a higher priority in your efforts to save them. But does that mean that you should sacrifice the overriding principle such that if it's a zero sum, and there's only one of two possibilities, you can either save Ran Arad, or, but by saving Ran Arad, you're also going to compromise the security of the country. There's no question. You have to, the security of the country takes priority over the Ran Arad, sadly, right? And that's clear from the essay.
Taking it out of the realm of halacha, the realm of secular aspect of.
No, not at all, Alan. It's not taking it from the religious to the secular. It's taking it from the realm of criminal Pidyon Shevuyim to military Pidyon Shevuyim. Two different rubrics of halacha. And that's the whole point of this essay, is not when we say that the state has to make the determination what the best choice to make, we're not saying take it out of the hands of halacha. We're saying that is the halacha. The state, based on its military prowess, determines what is in the best interests of the country. Kuda. Of course not. Of course not. It's the military experts, and the military experts are led by the state. Yes, Simi.
One other consideration, when it comes to Israel, the lines are a little bit blurred between an active Hayal and the Shevuyim, which technically is still a Hayal.
Well, according to Rav Shaul Yisraeli, anyone who's acting at the behest of the state to secure the state is a Hayal, is someone who takes priority in saving that person's life if they are taken captive. Absolutely. And therefore, Jonathan Pollard is included in this essay also. He was clearly not a military person.
That's not.
But yeah, but that's my point. Are these? I mean, take a look.
Again, I'm just saying.
Look at all these guys who have been not in the army, and all of a sudden they're all being drafted.
Then that's a Hamas line, that everybody is in the army, we're all soldiers.
Yeah,
They're like,
even babies. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Let's hear good news. Let's see all of our captives come home. Ezrat Hashem.